Isaiah chapter 42, and again, this is another video. We're going to do the whole video on one chapter, just because within one there is so much going on. It's interesting that there's two of those just in Isaiah alone. I've not done that since the Ten Commandments. This is continuing the speech from God in the previous video, and this is continuing the idea that he's clearly talking about someone special. So the expectation is this is talking about Jesus. But God is talking about a servant who is to come, who will do all of these things. And so he'll bring justice to the nations. Okay, great. He will not cry out or raise his voice on the streets. That's a bit of an odd one, but okay, fair enough. He will not falter or be discouraged. He will give hope through his teachings. He will be a covenant for the people. Very interesting, we'll come back to that one. He will be a light for the Gentiles. Also very interesting. And he will free captives and open eyes that are blind. So much going on in that. It's I think we'll finish it and then come back to the interesting points there. And in verse 13, it talks about the Lord will march out like a champion and stir up zeal like his warrior and triumph over his enemies. Again, we talked about this sort of previous one. I'm pretty sure, I lose track, that you can see why the Jews rejected Jesus as a Messiah on the grounds that they were expecting a warrior. Because a lot of this language is very warrior-tastic. I mean, the word warrior is actually in this part. So I think this is talking about God at this point, not necessarily Jesus, I think. But yeah, I mean, you can see where they're coming from. In verse 14, we've got God that's saying for a long time now he has been silent, which is, I mean, we're not sure that that's quite true, but it does sound like it's all about to kick off. It's difficult to work out, but it does all seem broadly positive in terms of bringing light to darkness, that sort of language. And then in verse 25, I thought I'd actually just read this one, just because it's interesting to illustrate. This gives me an excuse once again to dig out my very exciting birthday Bible. Because of the problem that it's so massive and it's just going to damage my shelf and it's very special, I've taken the step of finding a proper home for it to make sure it's properly looked after. Seems like a much better way of doing this. Anyway, so verse 25, it says, "So he poured out on them his burning anger, the violence of war. It enveloped them in flames, yet they did not understand. It consumed them, but they did not take it to heart." So this all seems to be talking about the Israelites. It's so difficult to work out what this is going on. So I googled this again. I'm pretty sure that's sort of cheating, but this stuff is hard enough. I think that's probably sensible. The Christians very definitely say this is, hands down, this is talking about Jesus. But interestingly, the Muslims say, no, it's talking about Muhammad. And the reason Muslims give for that is because Jesus didn't actually bring the law of God to everybody. So, okay, yeah, sort of you can see their argument there. This does rather tie in nicely to an objection I keep getting towards. Well, not an objection so much, but you get a lot of people look at you and go, okay, why Christianity? And my daughter's getting it a lot. And it's a really difficult one because without being an expert in every religion, you've got to have an open mind in terms of looking at them all. But my position was have a broad look at all of them and see if anything has anything about it that makes it stick and could be vaguely of interest. So I've read the Quran. From my position, all you can do is look at something and say, is there anything in this that I want to look at further? And the answer has been no. And because of that, I have no reason to think that the Muslim claim that this is actually talking about Muhammad makes any more sense than the Christian claim that it's talking about Jesus. I think it's very difficult for either way. But it's a great example of how you can get two opposing forces, as it were, that have completely different ideas about how the universe works and who God is and all the rest of that, can both interpret it as meaning it's theirs, as it were. And I appreciate Jesus is in the Quran, so they say he was a prophet and all the rest of it. But fundamentally, who the Christians say Jesus is conflicts with who Muslims say he is. So if one is right, the other is wrong. And yet they can both sort of lay a claim to it, as it were. And part of our problem here is to try and figure this stuff out. It is interesting, though, how we know for a fact this was written before Jesus was born, because we've got a copy of this scroll dated before that. But it is interesting how it does sort of fit. And there's that talk about be a light for the Gentiles. Because the Old Testament, as I understand it, this is all aimed at the Israelites. So the Gentiles are basically the non-Israelites. And then my understanding is that when Jesus comes along, that all changes. So it's the expansion of God's people being from the Israelites to everybody, to include the Gentiles. So that's very specifically a thing for Christianity. I suppose to some extent that's a thing for Islam as well, in that it was all sort of spread. But in the absence of anything else compelling for that, I'm just going to ignore that part of the equation and carry on with the Christianity bit, because that's the bit that seems to hold up so far. It's also interesting that there's scope for debate on whether Jesus fulfilled all of the above. So you've got bring justice to the nations. Well, I don't think that's really been a thing. I mean, it just may not be a thing yet. But potentially also you could argue that it's bringing justice in terms of dying on the cross to ensure everybody does get justice eventually, I guess. He's not cry out or raise his voice in the streets. There was a big thing where he goes and has a big old tantrum, as it were, in the marketplace or something, driving people out of the temple that was being turned into a marketplace. I think that sounds like there was some shouting there, so I guess that's not really true, but cry in the streets does sound like more like a travelling shouting person, maybe. So again, room for interpretation. Will not falter or be discouraged. Well, that definitely sounds like that fits the bill. Give hope through his teachings. That definitely fits the bill. Even today, there are people who get a great deal of hope from the Bible. To be a covenant for the people. That's the really interesting one, isn't it? Because I looked up some other translations of it, and most of them seem to be talking about God giving him as a covenant for the people. And in that respect, that fits beautifully with my understanding of what the crucifixion did, i.e. the Old Testament, the Old Covenant being follow these 613, 14 rules, goes out the window, replaced with, okay, now you can't justify by your works, you need to have faith in Jesus, and then you can go to heaven, as it were. So in that respect, Jesus dying on the cross is the new covenant, as I understand it. So that's a pretty hefty prophecy that matches up very well with the story that came later. Of course, it could have been that someone wrote up the Jesus story later on to fit with the Isaiah bit. But we've got our 6 historical facts established from the resurrection video. Basically, that Jesus was certainly playing this role, whether fraudulently or not, we don't know. But it certainly fits in terms of the concept and what people believed actually happened afterwards. So it's a very difficult thing to try and dismiss flippantly. I think it's a difficult thing to accept at face value as well, but it's pretty intriguing. And then finally we have free captives and open eyes that are blind. I guess there's a metaphorical angle to that, but I think there's also a miracle Jesus did where he opened someone's eyes. Literally they were blind and he healed them on the Sabbath, I think it was, or something like that. So there's potentially a literal element to that and a metaphorical element to that, I suppose. But yeah, these odd bits, they're so hard to do them justice because it's just such massive bits in them, and I'm not quite sure what any of the answers are. But there's quite a lot more of Isaiah still to go, so we will carry on and see if we can find anything else that helps flesh all this stuff out.